Today, we're going to dive into a topic that affects all of us: how to talk about money across generations. Now, you hear the phrase generational wealth all the time. That's not quite where we're going with this. But whether you're discussing your retirement with your parents or teaching your kids about saving, these conversations can be tricky, and we find often a barrier to people educating. So let's break it down and make it maybe a little bit easier for you guys today on Talking Sense. I've got Brian Helms here with me again today. Thank you so much. He's from our Bryant office. He's one of our advisors there, and he's been on the show with me a few times. He's learning. He's learning to kind of ride on this with me. This crazy boat. So, but I brought you here today because I think, we've talked a lot about how important it is to feel confident talking about these things, the impact it can have on generations within your family. And there's a lot that I didn't know before I worked here. You were a little further in your journey than me when you started working here. Yes. But let's talk about why it matters feeling confident about this and sharing with whether it's your parents or your kids.
Sure. Money isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about our values, our fears, our hopes for the future. When we can communicate effectively about finances across generations, we strengthen our families and set everyone up for a better financial health. And it also can strengthen those relationships.
Yes. I remember one really impactful story with my mom, which, she's no longer here now. But when she was retiring from teaching, I had already started working at Gen Wealth. I wasn't an advisor yet, but I had spent enough time working with John to have some understanding of different things. And she was trying to make a decision about her pension. And she was like, my stepdad is like 10 years older than her, 7 years older than her, I think. And she thought the chances of him living past her were pretty slim. So she was going to go with that single life option. And I said, Mom, I've seen it go bad. And you got to understand, if you live for 6 months, they get to keep the rest. And she switched it to the survivor option. And then she passed away within a year. And so I was very grateful for the education I had received. But if I had been too scared to have that conversation with her, my dad would have been without that income, and she would have poured into this thing for over 20 years to get zero back, barely, So, and I'm not saying that's right for everybody, but I think taking the time to weigh options and having open communication is important. And so when you're dealing with older generations, dealing with your parents or your grandparents, trying to have conversations, I think understanding their perspective is really, really important to be able to understand the context that they're speaking from.
Sure. Many of our parents and grandparents lived through significant economic events like the Great Depression or post-war booms. Those experiences shaped their person. They shaped how they handle money,
how they store leftovers.
Yes.
Butter tubs.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't know if your grandma was that way, but my grandma, every butter tub got reused.
Oh yeah. My parents, my mother still,
Yeah. But many of our parents, that did, those that had endured the Depression or post-war booms, that really turned them into kind of almost aggressive savers.
Yes.
In a lot of ways. So, I had a conversation with someone the other day. There was a plan we were putting together for them, and they had a particular piece of that plan. They said, my parents said, never touch it. Never touch it. They had a bad experience with one. Well, what their parent had a bad experience with wasn't the same thing, but they'd had such a negative experience with that one thing and had never had the opportunity to be reeducated that shaped how my client was making decisions about their financial journey. And so, when you're talking about, retirement planning or long-term care, those can be touchy. But if you don't have those conversations, it can come back to bite you because, statistically, I am more likely to become the caregiver for my parents than for them to go into a facility. Because most people have to do that. They have no other financial options. So if we have those conversations early, we might be able to set them up to win.
Definitely. Also estate planning and inheritance. That's not an easy topic, but, understanding their wishes can prevent family conflicts later in life. And, sometimes people receive inheritances they had no clue were coming their direction. We had a client come in recently, blown away.
Yeah.
No idea.
And was it overwhelming, do you think?
They were very much overwhelmed. Their parents had lived very frugally.
So they probably didn't even know their parents had wealth.
Had no idea their parents had any wealth at all. None at all.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
And so just trying to honor the parents while dealing with the tax consequences of this decision. And, I can imagine that would be so much. And I think for me, when I lost my mom, we didn't even know where to start. She didn't have good records. And I literally spent days going through filing cabinets trying to just understand what was going on with their financial picture, because my dad was mourning. My stepdad was just like trying to survive. And I had more experience in dealing with finance at that point. And so I told him, like, listen, I'll come in, I'll help. But it took us days just to understand where their money was and what was set on auto draft and what wasn't. Understanding if she had any life insurance and all that. Ooh, it was a lot. So, taking some time to at least understand the basics of maybe your parents or their grandparents, just like, hey, if something happens to you, who do I call? Who would be able to help me make sure that your estate is taken care of the way that it needs to be? And if they're not comfortable talking about that, there's not much you can do. Hope that they don't just have virtual statements.
Exactly.
Because then you're going to be playing the spelunking game of trying to hunt stuff down.
Yes.
But even for most of my clients who maybe don't want the details out there, they're often willing to at least say, whoever's going to be the trustee of their estate, if they have a plan, just say, hey, here's who you go talk to. Here's who would be able to help you in the event that something happens. And then sometimes we've got to help our parents deal with and understand new technologies. That was one of the challenges when my mom passed away with my stepdad, was that he hated digital anything. He wanted to walk into the bank to make deposits. He wanted to write a check for bills. The fact that things were on auto draft just blew his mind. But I was able to help him and coach him and teach him at least to embrace auto draft and for bills. Like, you don't have to worry about if the water bill gets paid on time if you're busy. It just magically happens. And I taught him how to just blend the two approaches.
Sure. The key here is to approach those conversations with respect and acknowledge their experiences and wisdom while gently introducing them. There are other ways for these things to happen. And, unfortunately, they're probably not going to go. We're not going back. Yeah. It's just going to become more and more digital.
Yes.
And we've just got to embrace it with little steps. And
I think pick your battles.
Yes.
I think when you're dealing with, adults in your life, we all have things that we have dug our heels in. Like I've joked that, like, there's things that are just not going to change about me. There's a lot of things that I'm flexible on, but there are some things that I've got my way of doing it. I'm not going to change it. It works for me. Don't battle those things, and don't treat them like they just don't know better. Don't belittle their system because it works for them, but maybe find a way to merge what they're doing in a way that if you had to pick it up tomorrow, you could. That's the key, is making sure that the information is accessible somewhere so that you can help them if the time comes that you need to. Now let's flip that and let's talk about younger generations. So when you're dealing with young children or teenagers or people who maybe you're trying to mentor, what are some ways to have those conversations be more effective?
Sure. The approach is going to vary here. With young children, it needs to be very basic concepts like saving, the value of money, a piggy bank, maybe a small allowance, can be great teaching tools, which are very age appropriate for them.
Yes. And I think the most important lesson, if I were to pick one thing that I feel like could set your kid up for success long-term, delayed gratification.
Oh, definitely.
I love my children, but this is an area my children struggle. If they can't have it right now, they get all stressed about it. And I let them. I'm not just giving in, but it's sometimes they need to understand that you can't just have something because you decide you want it. And I'm always open with my kids about, like, if we have a trip coming up, for instance, we went on a family vacation this year. So leading up to that, when they would say, hey, I want to go eat out tonight. I want to go do this. Can we just get pizza? I'd say, listen, we've got this trip coming up. I've budgeted for it, but if we spend this here, I'm going to have to cut something out there. And they'd be like, oh, never mind. Yeah. They were good with it.
Yes.
We had a client who came in, this has probably been 7 or 8 years ago. Their kid wanted Starbucks every single day after school. She would talk mom into going to Starbucks every single day. And Janet had this conversation where the daughter just happened to be there for their review, and they were struggling with, increasing savings, things like that. But they had a lot of wiggle room in their budget that they were just kind of using up. And she brought the daughter and she goes, quick question. If you had to choose between getting Starbucks every day and your parents having to live with you when they retire, or not getting Starbucks, but they get to be independent, which would you prefer? And she was like, oh, I can do without Starbucks. I can definitely do without Starbucks. So sometimes I think we as parents aren't open enough about the impact of day-to-day decisions because our kids don't understand the value of a dollar.
No. And I think our times are very much right now, it's all about me and right now. And because they see it on TV, social media, there's a million avenues for them to receive those messages. It's all about right now.
Yes. My daughter, the other day, we were in the car and she said something about wanting something and it frustrated her. And I was like, why are you so frustrated about this? You've got plenty of money. She goes, Mom, that's 3 hours of work. I have to work 3 hours to make enough for that. That's just ridiculous. And I was like, well, you're not wrong. I got paid $3.75 per hour, not $11.25. So I can appreciate this. It took me a long time to even be able to go get a Wendy's meal, so I get it. But she's starting to learn from her work the value of that. She's trying to save up for a car. And so she's understanding to manage her spending habits to keep her from overdoing it. But
that's a win that she made that that she equated 3 hours of work with whatever it was that she was wanting.
Yes, she is. She's starting to get there. And then as they start entering young adulthood, one of the things that I'm learning is letting my son fail. He's 17 and a half and he's got certain goals that he's wanting to chase. And as parents, I think in general, we want to avoid as much chaos for them as we can. That's just an instinct that we have. But I'm learning to let him fail in things that aren't as critical. So when he says, hey, Mom, what's in my account? I want to go out with my friends. And I'm like, well, you spent all your money. You're out. Oh, can you just put $5 in there? Nope. I'm sorry. I can't. I gave you what you budgeted. I give him a little bit of gas money because he runs errands for me. I gave him that for the week. It's not my job to worry about your social life. And so he's starting to learn. It took him about 3 paychecks to figure it out. We'll own that. But of me being super strict about it. And there's been some growing pains, but he's learning. We're about to start the conversation about student loans because he's looking at colleges now. And, his grades may or may not earn him a scholarship. We don't really know. It depends on how this year goes. Depends on what his ACT score is. But we're starting to talk about these things. We're starting to talk about building credit responsibly and starting to think more long-term than in the moment because those things are critical. I did finally get him to have a career option other than soccer. So I say that. I didn't get him to. He finally came to that on his own. That, he needs to have a plan B. But I think, as they're younger, you handhold more. But giving them that tool of delayed gratification is critical. And then as they get a little bit older, starting to open their eyes. The first time I took Elena shopping where she was spending her own money, the facial expressions she gave me were magical. She'd look at something and then she'd go, oh, Mom, this is $50. It's a sweatshirt. And I'd be like, yeah, I know. I know. She'd be like, that's 4 hours of work or 5 hours of work. I'd be like, yeah, I know. And it's the looks of disgust were magical.
Oh, yes.
And it's weird. Apparently, she's not nearly as strict about brand names now that, she understands that.
Okay.
So let's talk about that messy middle there, though. Despite our differences, a lot of generations do share some financial value. So when you're having that conversation, kind of what are some topics or themes that we all are concerned about?
It can be finding that common ground and security, independence, leaving a legacy are all things that, everybody shares in. And, it can be a great place to start finding those common values and to start a conversation.
And I have found that I think just being open about even the struggles that I've had financially, I hope are providing some insight to my kids. So in the last few months, I overspent 1 month and I had to, I was honest with my kids. I said, listen, it was in reference to the vacation. I was buying things for the vacation. I don't know why I felt like we needed new stuff. Anyway, it was a weak moment for me. And I had to acknowledge to my kids, I was like, listen, we can't go do that thing that you're wanting to do. I usually do pizza on Fridays. And I was like, hey guys, we're going to have to skip that for a few weeks. I overspent on some things and we've got to get back in balance. And they've been really good with that. And I think it helps them understand that you're going to make mistakes, move on. I had a client who shared some really negative things in their past that they had overcome with their kid, and it totally redirected his trajectory. So I feel like open and honest communication about those topics are really important. So let's talk about some key takeaways that we hope people can apply and use on their conversations.
You've just got to start the conversation. It may be awkward at first, but it gets easier. Also, learning to listen. That's so critical. It's hard because you think you've got something you've got to say they need to hear,
right?
But sometimes you need to listen to that older generation.
Yeah. And I think we could
viewpoint.
all learn to be patient and respectful and acknowledge that different is not necessarily wrong.
Yes.
I think we often want to just kind of push our own agenda, but as you mentioned, listening to understand, not to respond.
Yes.
I think that one's the piece that I tend to overlook sometimes in conversations is I skip ahead to trying to come up with my reaction or my response and not taking the time to listen actively. And then also, communication when it comes to financial topics, it's an ongoing process. So it's not a one-time event. You're going to have to go back and forth and really lean into the tools and resources that you have. So I know we have a challenge we're going to issue, Brian. I'm going to let you share that with everybody before we get done here today.
Sure. The challenge for this week is to initiate a financial conversation with a family member from a different generation. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be a heavy topic. Start it small if you need to. The important thing is to open that line of communication.
Yes. So get out there. If you've got someone in your life you feel like is being successful, now's your chance to go pick their brain. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to Talking Sense. And if you like what you hear, make sure and subscribe to the podcast to get all the newest episodes. The Jim Wealth team is available to you 24/7 at info@getreadyforthefuture.com or by calling our offices at 866-653-PLAN. That's 866-653-7526. And while we like to have fun here, we're also financial advisors, and that means disclosures. You should personally consult a financial advisor before making any investment, and no strategy can assure success. Securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advice offered through Independent Advisor Alliance. Independent Advisor Alliance and Jim Wealth Financial Advisors are separate entities from LPL Financial.